Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take another look at one of my older reviews and bring it up to my more current quality standards. Today I'm taking another look at Half-Life 2, along with Episode 1, Episode 2, and Lost Coast. And while the original game and both episodes were released on PC, Mac, Linux, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3, Half-Life 2 itself was also released on the original Xbox, and Lost Coast saw a release only on PC, Mac, and Linux. And all of the footage that you'll be seeing throughout this video is of the PC version of each of these. This is a first-person shooter and the sequel to Half-Life. It was developed and published by Valve and actually distributed through their brand new service called Steam, which at the time was not very well liked, but over the years it has gotten more of a positive reception as they've continued to add new features and improve its stability and everything like that. But anyway, the base game was released in 2004 to an exceptionally positive reception across the board, with some people claiming that it was the best game ever made, which was definitely very hyperbolic. But there's no denying that at the time this released, it was a technical powerhouse featuring a fairly advanced for the era physics system, which was a major component of their new Source engine, which of course powered Half-Life 2 as well as Lost Coast Episode 1 and Episode 2, but it actually didn't get released with Half-Life 2. It got released a few days earlier with Counter-Strike Source, although Counter-Strike Source certainly did not use the engine to its fullest potential. But as for Half-Life 2 itself, it was released in November of 2004, right in the middle of the month, with Counter-Strike Source being released at the very beginning of the month. Lost Coast was released in October of 2005 as a free download to anybody who actually had Half-Life 2 already, and we received the releases of Half-Life 2 Episode 1 in June of 2006 and Episode 2 in October of 2007, respectively. And with the exception of Lost Coast, which I'm really only including in this video for the sake of completeness, considering it is just a tech demo for the high dynamic range lighting that they would introduce to the engine later on, all of these got a lot of critical acclaim, although Episode 1 noticeably less so than the other two substantial ones, and it's gone on to become one of the most absurdly overhyped games of all time. And like with the original Half-Life, it has a very rabid fan base, a lot of which is very toxic and likes to lash out at anybody who even remotely criticizes the game. But there is a major difference between Half-Life 1 and Half-Life 2. You see, Half-Life 1 earned its status as a legendary game because you do have that pre-Half-Life and post-Half-Life era of game design, with regards to first-person shooters at least. But you really can't say the same thing about Half-Life 2. Sure, it was a technical marvel for its time, but other than that, it was really just a refinement of things that they had already done in the original Half-Life. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but the way people were acting when this originally released was completely disproportionate to what the game actually did. Which of course leads me into the central question of this video. What exactly is Half-Life 2? How does it hold up to its predecessor? How does it hold up after all of these years? And was it really some massive new peak for first-person shooter gaming like people thought it was at the time? Or was it something else entirely? Well, let's go ahead and delve right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which as I mentioned runs on their brand new, at the time anyway, Source engine, which featured some massive improvements to things like modeling and texture quality, of course, compared to the original Half-Life, but it also featured a new animation system where you could really get a lot of high-quality facial animations out of the characters, and they used that new animation system to very strong effect here. In fact, it was used so well that it wouldn't really be surpassed until a fair few years later, and even to this day, it actually still holds up reasonably well, although it certainly looks a bit dated now. Aside from simple improvements to modeling, texture quality, and animation quality, they also significantly improved the lighting system for this to the point where it actually still holds up very well to this day. Obviously, these days we have considerably more advanced lighting techniques available, and we even have things like RTX technology available, but at the time this released, this was a brand new standard in lighting, which was only really rivaled by Doom 3, and even then only in the dark. And that lighting system would only be improved over the years. For example, when Lost Coast came out, it was a tech demo for a brand new feature they were implementing in the engine for later releases, which was high dynamic range lighting, and that made it look even better. And as they continued to improve the engine, they would actually end up retroactively patching Half-Life 2 to include some of these new features and some some optimizations and things like that. So what you're seeing in this video is not exactly the same as what you would see back in 2004. Now granted, some of those engine features that they patched in were not used to especially good effect in Half-Life 2 because they would require them to go back into the game files and modify a bunch of things for it to actually work properly, but they are still present and you do notice them on occasion. It's just that they are much more noticeable in Half-Life 2 Episode 1 and more importantly Episode 2, where they had the most advanced version of the engine available at that time. So you do notice a gradual improvement in visual quality as you progress through Half-Life 2, then Lost Coast, then Episode 1 and Episode 2, although it doesn't change a huge amount between the individual games. And it's also worth noting that the main reason you notice the improvements in Episode 2 more than Episode 1 is that Episode 2 actually opens up the levels a lot more, and it's more in line with the kind of level design you would see in basic Half-Life 2, where there's a lot more wide open spaces that you can navigate, whereas the levels in Episode 1 are a lot more cramped and don't really get to show off the new engine features as much. Now all of that said, there are some noticeable issues with the visuals that were even present at the time. First, even though the physics system was definitely very impressive for its time, it does use ragdoll physics, and those always looked ridiculous even back in the day. Next, the modeling and texture work are more in line with 2004 standards than they are with 2007 standards, so even by the time Episode 2 came out, the modeling and texture work was starting to look a bit dated. And of course, they don't hold up especially well by 2020 standards in particular. On top of all of this, if you had the misfortune of playing one of the console versions of this, they actually had noticeably degraded visuals compared to the PC version, and more importantly, if you played it on the original Xbox, that is a downright inferior version that runs like absolute garbage and looks pretty bad. But all things considered, the visuals still hold up remarkably well. Then you move over into sound design, and that's where things start to change a bit. You see, one of the big strengths of Half-Life 2, and of course Episodes 1 and 2 as well, was the voice acting, which actually still holds up very well across the board, although some of it is a bit cheesy. A lot of the voices from the original Half-Life make a return, and they are considerably higher quality sound than what you heard in Half-Life 1, so that helps a lot. But even aside from that, they all do a pretty good job of voicing their characters with a decent amount of character and emotion behind them, although this was still a relatively early development for a video game at the time, and especially a first-person shooter, so it does occasionally have some rough edges. And speaking of rough edges, there's the soundtrack, which is primarily composed of electronic music, and in the later episodes you would see them expand a bit more into things like rock. But apart from a few well-timed ambient tracks, there's not really a whole lot in there that's particularly memorable, and you more often than not just don't even notice the music unless it's just blaring in your ear during a particularly intense combat sequence. This does ultimately mean that even though the soundtrack does occasionally have its moments, for the most part it's pretty forgettable. And then of course there's the sound effects, which even though they do have some nice processing on them based on the environments you're in, unfortunately most of the sound effects in this are just not especially good. Don't get me wrong, you could certainly do a lot worse as far as first-person shooter sound effects goes, but none of them are especially impressive, and the best they really manage to be is decent. But when you bring everything together, the presentation of Half-Life 2 and its subsequent episodes actually still holds up reasonably well, and it's easy to see how much of a technical powerhouse it was back in 2004. But here's the thing, as impressive as the tech was at the time this originally released, and as well as that still holds up, what really matters and what have always mattered are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this takes place several years after the events of the original Half-Life. Gordon Freeman awakes from the stasis he was placed in by the G-Man at the end of the original Half-Life to find the world has been overtaken by an alien empire known as the Combine. At some point after the Black Mesa incident, they showed up on Earth and defeated all of Earth's militaries in what became known as the 7-Hour War, after which they set up a brutally oppressive police state which has effectively enslaved what is left of humanity. When Gordon is awakened from stasis, he finds himself on a train bound for City 17, which is the site of the Combine Citadel, basically their headquarters on planet Earth, and as he goes through the arrival area, he is eventually detained by a Combine officer who pulls him into an interrogation room and reveals himself to actually be Barney Calhoun in disguise. And in case for whatever reason you're not aware, he was the protagonist from the second expansion for the original Half-Life, which was Half-Life Blue Shift. It turns out he's been working undercover in Combine Civil Protection and has been trying to help the resistance movement work against the Combine, and he gets in contact with Dr. Isaac Kleiner, one of the scientists Gordon worked with at Black Mesa and who survived the incident, who is also working on a teleporter to help get people out of the city, and sends Gordon off to meet up with Kleiner. Along the way, the Combine take notice of Gordon and start going after him, and eventually end up trapping him in an apartment building where they knock him out briefly, and he is ultimately rescued by Alex Vance, the daughter of one of the other scientists that Gordon was working with, Eli Vance. She helps Gordon get to Kleiner's lab, upon which point he dons the HEV suit once more and is basically roped into helping out with the entire resistance movement, and during a failed attempt at teleporting Gordon over to Eli Vance's research facility at what they're referring to as Black Mesa East, Gordon's presence is revealed to Wallace Breen, who is the former administrator of the Black Mesa facility, but who is now working together with the Combine to enslave the populace of Earth, and the Combine end up enacting a manhunt for Gordon as he ends up having to flee City 17 on foot and eventually by airboat, which of course ends up dragging Gordon into events far larger than himself, much like in the original game, only this time it involves a mass uprising against the Combine. And as the story continues, you find out very quickly that it's not so much the story itself that's interesting about this, at least not at the time the game was released. It's more the way the story was told, where apart from some extremely brief sequences, you almost never lose control of Gordon throughout the entire game. You're constantly seeing everything through his eyes. This is sometimes to the game's detriment when you go into a sequence which is actually a cutscene, but you still retain control over Gordon, and you can still interact with things in the environment, making the entire gravity of the situation completely ridiculous when you're just throwing random objects at people or whatever the case may be. In fact, cutscenes like that are far more common than the cutscenes that actually take at least some degree of control away from you, but even the ones that do take some control away from you still allow you to look around. Of course, this does mean that all of the cutscenes in the game are completely unskippable. This means that whether the player wants to or not, they're going to experience the story when they go through this, and what they are going to experience is ultimately just a fairly underwhelming story for the most part, although it does occasionally have its moments. Much like in the original Half-Life, Gordon doesn't say a word the entire game and doesn't really have a character of his own, so any of the character moments have to rely on all the other characters, and they do an okay job of that, but it's really nothing impressive. And as for what actually happens throughout the course of the storyline, I'm not going to spoil it all for you, but suffice to say, it's a fairly run-of-the-mill Resistance storyline that ultimately culminates in a cliffhanger ending, which leaves things rather ambiguous for the eventual follow-up. But interestingly enough, between when the game starts and when it ends on that cliffhanger, there is an awful lot of what I would describe as filler content, where it doesn't really have any actual bearing on the story at all, it's just there for gameplay's sake more than anything else, and in several instances those sequences drag on for far too long and end up just completely tanking the pacing of the storyline. That's not to say that all of the filler content is bad. I mean, most people would probably say that the best part of the game is We Don't Go to Ravenholm, which is actually a filler sequence where you're going through the ruined town of Ravenholm, which is completely infested by headcrabs and headcrab zombies. But the only reason that really works is because it's an extremely atmospheric section that actually still holds up even to this day. But the rest of the filler sequences in the game really do not hold up anywhere near as well as We Don't Go to Ravenholm, and unfortunately they just end up dragging the game down entirely. And a lot of that isn't so much from the way the story is told in those sequences, because there really isn't much story told in those sequences, but rather the way they actually play out. So let's talk about the gameplay. As I mentioned before, this is a first-person shooter, and it plays in a very similar manner to the original Half-Life, where you have weapon categories that feature things like your iconic crowbar, as well as a 9mm pistol, a 357 Magnum, shotgun, submachine gun, a sniper crossbow instead of a sniper rifle, as well as things like a grenade, a rocket launcher, so on and so forth. Not all of the weapons from the original Half-Life make a return, however. In fact, the weapon selection in this is noticeably smaller than the original Half-Life, with the only new weapons being the addition of the Combine Pulse Rifle, which is an assault rifle in the primary fire and shoots out an energy orb that is capable of destroying nearly anything in a single hit with the secondary fire. But much more importantly than that, you get what is called the Gravity Gun, which allows you to pick up various objects in the environment and throw them at a high velocity at things, or you can pick up and move objects around and gently drop them so you can either build up a bunch of crates so you can jump to a higher ledge or something along those lines. And of course, the Gravity Gun's ammunition is just whatever you can find in the environment. There's no charges you have to replenish or anything like that, so you can just use that whenever you're low on ammo, which is extremely rare throughout the campaign anyway, or if there's something advantageous about the environment you want to manipulate, like, say, picking up an explosive barrel and throwing it at a group of enemies or something along those lines. At the time, it was a very novel concept and quickly spawned a bunch of imitations, most notably the Grabber in Doom 3 Resurrection of Evil, as well as various similar ideas like telekinesis spells or the kinetic module in Dead Space or things along those lines. The thing is, while this was a fresh and interesting concept in 2004, unfortunately, even its own introductory game wears its welcome out fairly quickly. Not necessarily due to the combat applications of the Gravity Gun, which are still satisfying to this day. I mean, it's always fun being able to pick up a big saw blade and shoot it out at a group of headcrab zombies and slice them all in half, or pick up an explosive barrel or something along those lines and fling it at a group of enemies to send them flying. But what's not so fun about the game is the implication that all of the puzzles in this should be some degree of physics-based. And by that I mean basically propping up a bunch of platforms so you can get to a higher location. Now I'll be fair, they do try to change some things up here and there by throwing in a few sequences where you have to go through a physics-based puzzle where it deals with buoyancy as opposed to just weighing something down, but the end result is still either going to be creating a ramp or creating a platform that you can jump on. The thing is, they don't only throw these sequences between combat encounters to try to spice things up, they also throw them into vehicle sections where you might be moving along at a pretty brisk pace and then all of a sudden have to bring the game to a screeching halt so you can get out of the vehicle and solve a very brief, very simplistic physics puzzle so you can progress, thus dragging the game out even further than it already is. And the worst part about these puzzles is not the simple presence of puzzles themselves, but the fact that they're all physics-based, and because they're physics-based, they're all brain-dead simplistic. A well-designed puzzle will have the player do some thought first, but every single puzzle in Half-Life 2 is merely a matter of seeing that it's a physics-based puzzle and then instantly knowing exactly what you need to do, ultimately making all of the puzzles in this game an absolute chore. And more often than not, they actually make already tedious sections even more tedious. I mean, think about it this way. All of the vehicle sections are just long, drawn-out, extremely linear sequences where you're just trying to get from point A to point B, and all you're really doing in between is avoiding obstacles in your path. Occasionally you might have to get out of your vehicle to perform a basic physics puzzle to create a ramp or whatever else you need to progress, or you'll need to go through a brief combat encounter in order to flip a switch to open the gate to the next area, but mostly it just ends up being long, tedious sequences of holding the forward button and occasionally pressing left or right to try to avoid obstacles. All the while contending with the fact that the vehicles simply do not handle well. And that just makes these vehicle sections incredibly tedious to play through. So the puzzles are well-intentioned but ultimately boring, and the vehicle sections are just plain boring, but what about the rest of the gameplay? Well, it still plays like Half-Life for the most part. You still have the same basic combat loop, where you have health and you have suit energy, which you can replenish by going to various stations, as well as finding pickups in the world, and you'll be fighting a variety of enemies throughout the game, from things that you would recognize from the original Half-Life, like headcrabs and headcrab zombies, to the new Combine forces, which are mostly just the replacement for soldiers, although they do throw in things like manhacks, which are flying blade drones that are incredibly annoying because they're fairly fast and small and hard to hit, at least until you get access to the gravity gun anyway. You can just pick them up and throw them at things. And they do also throw in 2 new types of headcrabs with 2 new associated types of headcrab zombies. Those being fast head crabs, which are, like the name implies, a lot faster than the standard ones, but are also weaker and produce fast head crab zombies, which are, again, weaker, but are a lot faster and able to leap at you from a distance. Or the much more irritating poison head crab, which creates a head crab zombie that has a bunch of these things latched onto it, and it will continue to fling them at you until it's down to only the one on its actual head, before which point it can absorb a pretty ludicrous amount of damage before actually being destroyed. And the poison head crabs themselves, whenever they hit you, immediately drop you down to 1 health point. Now your suit will administer an antidote which will gradually replenish the lost health points, but it can be interrupted either by you finding a health pack or by you taking additional damage, which means that the poison head crabs are pretty much priority 1 as far as your targets go. Now, as I mentioned before, you do have a variety of weapons with which to dispatch all of these foes, but some of them are considerably more useful than others, the most useful and versatile being the gravity gun, but you'll also find that the 357 Magnum is still incredibly powerful, especially if you get headshots with it, although you're still very low on ammo throughout the entire game. The crossbow is still powerful, but very situational because the projectiles actually have a travel time before they hit whatever you're aiming at, so you need to be careful with those. The shotgun is still very powerful and useful, and the secondary fire on the submachine gun still launches a grenade that is quite powerful, although you get very few of them. And then, like I said before, the pulse rifle's secondary fire launches at an energy orb that will disintegrate pretty much anything with a single hit, although certain enemies are more resistant to it, and it does also send the projectile bouncing all over the place. And you'll find out very quickly that your most useful weapons are going to be the 357, the shotgun, and to some degree the pulse rifle, mainly because the pulse rifle is basically the same primary fire as the submachine gun, but with a lot more damage and a lot better accuracy, where the submachine gun is just going to spray bullets all over the place, all of which do very little damage. That said, you gain access to a lot more ammunition with the submachine gun, so it ends up being used more by default than the pulse rifle, even though the pulse rifle itself is a more useful weapon. And in general, the combat loop is better than the original Half-Life, although you do run into a lot more hit scanners in this than you did in the original game, and you're still going to be dealing with certain enemies that are definitely bullet sponges. But once you gain access to the gravity gun, things start to open up a bit more, and you can use the environment to your advantage, whether that be picking up, say, a saw blade or something else that's heavy and launching it at enemies if, say, you're low on ammo or you just feel like it, or being able to pick up items and hold them between you and the enemy, so the item will take all of the shots instead of you actually taking damage. Or you can launch flammable liquid containers at enemies to set them ablaze, or you can launch explosive barrels at enemies and send them flying in an explosion reminiscent of that of a grenade. Or you'll have certain situations where an enemy will be on a platform, and then you can either fling an object into the platform, or you can destroy the supports underneath the platform and send them falling to their doom below. And moments like that are when the game is firing on all cylinders, and it actually becomes quite entertaining. Part of the problem with that, however, is that you don't get access to the gravity gun until about a third of the way through the game, and from then on out, moments where the game is firing on all cylinders and you're presented with all of these combat options are relatively few and far between, in favor of fairly linear sequences where you're pretty much forced to shoot at enemies with your standard weapons. And while the gunplay itself is certainly better than the original Half-Life, that's admittedly not saying all that much. The original Half-Life's gunplay was never particularly good to begin with, and while they have made improvements here, it still wasn't especially good even by the time it came out. It's certainly serviceable gunplay, it does function, and it is playable, but it's just not especially satisfying. And as a result, when you bring everything together, you find out very quickly that Half-Life 2, even in its day, was extremely overrated. Pretty much everybody was completely wrapped up in all of the technical aspects of the game, which certainly were very impressive for the time, but what really matters in a video game is story and especially gameplay, and that's just not what Half-Life 2 excels at. And ultimately, I have an extremely difficult time giving this anything more than a 3.5 out of 5. Sure, those technical aspects count for a lot in this game, and it does have its moments, but they're relatively few and far between. And because the game is paced so poorly and has so many long, drawn-out sequences that are just plain boring, that means that few and far between actually is quite a big distance. So Half-Life 2 admittedly has its moments, but there was definitely a lot of room for improvement. Now, we wouldn't see any substantial development of the series until Episode 1, but before we got to Episode 1, we got the release of Lost Coast, which, as I mentioned, was a free download to anybody who already owned a copy of Half-Life 2, and was basically just a single-level demo that was going to show off their new high dynamic range lighting. So while there's not a huge amount to cover there, I do want to briefly go over it just for the sake of completeness. What exactly do you get in Lost Coast? Well, you get a single level where Gordon finds himself in the small village of St. Olga, which has been taken over by the Combine and converted into an artillery platform for them to shell the Resistance with. It has absolutely no bearing on any of the story content from Half-Life 2 or either episode, so it's just a roughly 10-minute combat encounter for you to play through. There's no new mechanics or really even puzzles to solve, it's just a straight combat encounter, and it's in a rather beautiful location that actually still holds up pretty well to this day in terms of aesthetics. As for the combat itself, well, it's Half-Life 2 combat, but a lot of it takes place on the cliff sides and you don't have a lot of room to maneuver, so it can be a bit annoying at first, but once you get into an area that opens up a bit more, the combat becomes more palatable, and they cap everything off with a fight against a gunship. So it's a pretty decent combat encounter, all things considered, that hits all of the main points that you would expect from a combat encounter from around the midpoint of Half-Life 2. And of course, it is a free download if you own Half-Life 2 already, so if you liked Half-Life 2, then there was no real reason not to play through Lost Coast at least once. Now with Lost Coast out of the way, let's go ahead and start talking about Episode 1, which was the first major development we had in the Half-Life 2 storyline after, of course, Half-Life 2 released. And it picks up immediately where Half-Life 2 left off, with that cliffhanger ending where Gordon and Alex's fate was left rather ambiguous, with the G-Man having stopped time during the explosion of the Citadel in order to try to whisk Gordon away. Well, the G-Man is interrupted doing this by the Vortigaunts, who rescue both Gordon and Alex, and then they find themselves at the bottom of the Citadel Tower, which houses a reactor that is currently going critical. From there, Gordon and Alex have to find a way to stabilize the reactor long enough to be able to escape City 17 before the reactor goes completely critical and destroys the entire city. And apart from the interesting implications of the Vortigaunts' ability to manipulate the space-time continuum in a very similar manner to the G-Man, most of Episode 1 is actually spent with just Gordon and Alex trying to desperately escape the city while the Combine are on their tail. And of course the Combine are mad not simply that Gordon and Alex managed to make the reactor go critical in the first place, but they also managed to steal a data packet that the Combine was trying to transmit back to their homeworld. They do try to flesh Alex out as a character a bit more, and they do also try to have her bond a bit more with Gordon, but when you've got one character doing all the talking, that makes things pretty difficult. As a result, a lot of what they tried to do with the story in this ends up falling flat, and it mostly ends up serving as a transitional piece between Half-Life 2 and Episode 2 more than anything else. And if you view it in that capacity, it mostly ends up being a standalone expansion that is very short in length, being maybe 3 or 4 hours long at most, and it mostly just ends up treading the same ground that the base game did, but not doing it quite as well. They do start you off with the gravity gun this time around instead of starting off with a crowbar, but you'll be stuck with only the gravity gun for a pretty large portion of the episode. They do at least supercharge it early on, where in the original Half-Life 2 it was only supercharged at the very end of the game, and at that point it would allow you to pick up enemies themselves and throw them around, or just zap them for instant death or things like that. But after a while that does expire and it goes back to the standard gravity gun, upon which point you start gaining access to more of the traditional weapons. The thing is, they start off by not giving you a huge amount of ammunition for your weapons, and you end up having to rely a lot more on Alex for a large portion of the game, where you are going through the dark and running into a bunch of zombies. Now, Alex herself is a pretty capable combatant, but unfortunately she can't see in the dark, so you have to shine the light on the zombies so she can shoot at them, and you'll find out very quickly that not only can she just shoot at the zombies, but if they get too up close and personal with her, she can actually attack them in a melee animation that will instantly kill them. You do still have to be careful though, because even though she can take a ludicrous amount of damage before going down, she can still go down, and if she does, then it's game over and it starts over from the last save. But apart from Alex's new capabilities, the only really new thing they do as far as gameplay mechanics go is introduce the Zombine, which is a head headcrab zombified combine soldier, which can take a lot more damage than a standard headcrab zombie and can also whip out a grenade and rush at you to try to blow you up. Of course, if you use the gravity gun, then you can actually whip the grenade right out of their hands and launch it across the room or launch it right back at them, and it effectively nullifies the problem, but it is still a new threat that you have to deal with. But Alex's enhanced capabilities and the Zombine are not enough to prop up the entirety of Episode 1, and it mostly just ends up being a pretty tedious slog. And with it not doing much in terms of story other than serving as a transition piece between Half-Life 2 and Episode 2, as well as introducing the idea that the Vortigaunts can mess around with the space-time continuum, it ultimately just ends up being a pretty subpar episode overall that I really can't give anything more than a 2 out of 5. It's certainly not terrible, but it doesn't really improve upon the core formula of Half-Life 2 either, and it being so short and so inconsequential to the grand scheme of the story ultimately just make it a fairly pointless expansion. So with Episode 1 being more or less a bust, what about Episode 2? How does that stack up? Well, it takes place immediately after Episode 1 ends, where the train that Alex and Gordon were on and were escaping from City 17 with ended up derailing, and they once again find themselves on foot trying to make their way back to the Resistance. Along the way, Alex is severely injured, and in Gordon's attempt to save her life, he has to fight his way through an antlion nest in order to get some larval extracts so Vortigaunts can go into what is called the Vortessence and ultimately bring her back from the brink of death. But while they're distracted doing that, the G-Man stops time again and contacts Gordon, saying that Alex is actually very important to his plans, and while she's unconscious, he gives her a message to give to her father Eli, which is prepare for unforeseen consequences. From there, the story mostly involves Gordon and Alex trying to find their way back to the Resistance base at White Forest and defend it against Combine onslaught, while the scientists work on a project to try to stop the Combine from developing a super portal and either escaping Earth or bringing the rest of their forces back to Earth so they can wipe out humanity once and for all. And unlike both basic Half-Life 2 and especially Episode 1, this is actually pretty meaty as far as story and lore goes. It introduces some things and expands upon others in such a way that you are left with a lot more questions than answers by the end of it, and it also ends on a cliffhanger, which left things open to be resolved in what they originally planned to be Half-Life 2 Episode 3, but that never came to fruition. And because the story is considerably more in the spotlight with this particular game, it means that the pacing is considerably more important. Unfortunately, they haven't really rectified the problems with pacing in this that were also present in Episode 1 to a lesser degree, and more importantly, base Half-Life 2. To make matters worse, they also doubled down on several of the elements that were more annoying about base Half-Life 2 that Episode 1 avoided for the most part simply because it was so short, but are much more prevalent in this one, like the physics puzzles and the drawn-out vehicle sequences. In fact, just to get to the vehicle section at all, you have to complete yet another seesaw puzzle, but on a larger scale than what you saw before. Much like with the previous episode, you don't get any new weapons or anything of that nature, you just get some new things that you can throw around with the gravity gun, which is certainly appreciated, but it's still kind of disappointing. But they do at least introduce a new enemy type in the Hunters, which are these large enemies that can take quite a bit of punishment and that launch exploding flechettes at you, but which are also capable of going pretty much wherever you can go. So they're actually very dangerous new enemies, and they fit the game surprisingly well. And thankfully, unlike the previous episode being a lot of very cramped environments, here the environments open up considerably and you get a lot more outdoor areas to mess around with, which works considerably better in the Source engine than the more cramped environments. And even though the episode does start out rather slow, by the end of it you're getting some pretty intense combat sequences that actually flow pretty well for the most part, and it ends up being some of the better Half-Life 2 gameplay that you'll experience. And that, combined with the improved focus on story and adding to the lore and actually moving the plot forward, actually ends up making Episode 2 a much more enjoyable experience than not just Episode 1, but even parts of the base Half-Life 2, although it does still suffer from a lot of the same problems that Half-Life 2 did. It doesn't do anything especially new, but what it does reasonably well, and it ultimately ends up being a 3 out of 5. A solid entry in the Half-Life series, but unfortunately it has also also aged about as well as the base game did. And of course, by the time Episode 2 came out, the source engine was starting to look a bit dated, and we also had the release of Crisis that same year, so it definitely was not top dog anymore as far as tech. And then of course you have to factor in that it left the story unresolved. It was a cliffhanger ending that was intended to lead into what was going to be Episode 3, but as the years went on, it became more obvious that Episode 3 was just not going to be a thing, and then Valve basically came out and said that they had scrapped the idea for Episode 3 entirely, and while they would return to the Half-Life universe with the recently released Half-Life Alyx, unfortunately that ended up being a prequel to Half-Life 2 that was also VR exclusive, thus severely limiting the actual player base. So who knows whenever they're going to end up returning to the storyline set forth in Half-Life 2 and both of its episodes, but as it stands, Half-Life 2 Episodes 1 and 2 are prime examples of what can go horribly wrong with an episodic series. And when you take the entire saga of Half-Life 2 as a whole, what you end up with is a game that was very heavily predicated on its technical elements, and whenever a game does that, it never ages well. Mechanically, Half-Life 2 is just an okay first-person shooter at best, and in hindsight, the physics elements that seemed so new and fresh back in 2004 are extremely gimmicky. And once you get past those technical elements, you find that the gameplay itself is just okay at best, and the storytelling, while certainly interesting and working pretty well at its best, often ends up being a detriment more than anything else, and the long sequences of just drawn-out, tedious gameplay really drag all of the experience down as a result. And unlike the original Half-Life, which did have its problems but ultimately got a sort of greatest hits release in Opposing Force, which was more or less a condensed version of what you did in the original Half-Life but done slightly better, you don't really get that with Half-Life 2. The experience you get between Half-Life 2 and Episodes 1 and 2 is very consistent, but with some very slight tweaks here and there, none of which really make them all that different from one another. Sure, Episode 1 introduces the Zombine, and Episode 2 continues to use that, but also introduces the Hunters, but it doesn't really shake things up all that much. You're not getting any new weapons, you're not really approaching combat in a particularly different manner, it's just more of the same. And if you liked Half-Life 2, that's not really a problem, but if you were fairly ambivalent toward it, it does wear on you pretty quickly. And unlike the original Half-Life, which I can recommend to pretty much anybody who's a fan of first-person shooters purely for its historical value, I can't really say the same about Half-Life 2 and its episodes. I can recommend it to fans of Half-Life, but other than that, it's a fairly hard sell. The tech that was once very impressive back in 2004 is no longer impressive, and once you get past that, you're left with a game that's just okay. Even at its worst, it's certainly not terrible, but even at its best, it's not particularly great either. And as a result, if you've never played Half-Life 2 before, the only time I could even possibly recommend you even look into it is when it's on sale for a really deep discount. Thanks for watching, and if you like the kind of videos I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every cent I get from that goes directly back into the channel in some regard, whether that be getting additional games for review or additional equipment or whatever the case may be. And if you can't afford to contribute or don't want to, then don't worry, I understand, it's perfectly fine. Thank you all again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.